I was 34 years old, flipping burgers at my own backyard barbecue in late June when my wife's best friend asked me when I was finally going to leave her. My name's Ethan. I run a small landscaping company, and up until that moment, I thought I had everything figured out. Laura and I had been married for 9 years. We owned a beautiful house in the suburbs that I'd renovated mostly by myself. And from the outside, we looked like the couple everyone wanted to be. We didn't have kids yet because Laura always said she wanted to focus on her career first. She was climbing the ladder at this marketing firm downtown. And I respected that because I figured we had time. I trusted her completely. Never checked her phone. Never questioned where she was. Never had that nagging doubt. Looking back now, I realized that wasn't trust. That was just me being oblivious. The barbecue was Laura's idea to celebrate her recent promotion to senior account manager, and she'd invited maybe 20 people, most of them her coworkers, plus a few of my people. My business partner, Ryan, was there with his wife, Olivia. My sister Hannah had shown up early to help prep, and I'd spent the morning setting up tables, stringing lights, stocking coolers with beer. Laura had been buzzing around in this sundress I'd never seen before, laughing louder than usual, and I just thought she was happy about the promotion. I was at the grill with my tongs, watching burgers sizzle and listening to people laugh, thinking this was exactly the life I'd worked for. Megan showed up around 2 o'clock in the afternoon, already tipsy, which wasn't unusual because Megan had a reputation for being the messy friend who said whatever was on her mind after drinks. She was Laura's best friend since college. One of those people who prided herself on brutal honesty, which really just meant she was rude and blamed it on alcohol. She walked straight to the cooler, grabbed a beer, and posted up near the grill where I was working. I could smell vodka on her breath when she leaned in, asking how the burgers were coming. She stood there swaying slightly, watching me, and then she asked if Laura had told me about Jason yet. I had no idea who Jason was. I looked up from the grill and asked what she meant, and Megan laughed the sharp, bitter laugh and said Laura really hadn't told me. She took a long drink, looked around, checking who was listening, and then said it loud enough that conversations near us started dying down. "When are you finally going to leave her?" It wasn't even a question. It was almost an accusation. Ryan heard it from across the yard and started walking toward us. Hannah stopped mid-sentence and turned to stare, and the people standing closest went completely silent. I stood there with tongs in my hand, smoke rising behind me, asking Megan what she was talking about. She tilted her head like I was a child who didn't understand something obvious and asked if I knew. I said I didn't know anything. And that's when her eyes went wide and she looked scared for a second. She put her hand over her mouth and whispered, "Wait, he doesn't know." I heard someone gasp and I saw Laura come out the back door carrying a tray of buns. She took one look at the scene at Megan standing next to me and everyone staring in silence, and the tray slipped right out of her hands and crashed onto the deck. Buns went everywhere. The ceramic plate shattered and Laura just stood frozen. I looked at my wife, then back at Megan and asked what I was supposed to know. Megan glanced at Laura, then back at me and said, "Jason from the office." They'd been together and she trailed off because she didn't need to finish. I saw it written all over Laura's face. My wife looked absolutely panicked and she started walking toward me with her hands up. I kept my eyes locked on Laura and asked if it was true. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out at first, then managed to say we should talk inside. I said, no, we could talk right here since apparently everyone except me already knew. Laura started crying, mascara running down her face, and she looked at Megan saying she had no right. Megan shrugged and said, "Somebody needed to tell me." And that's when I realized this wasn't new information to anyone but me. I looked around at the faces in my backyard, Laura's coworkers, people I'd fed and entertained, and I could see guilt and discomfort in their expressions. They knew. I asked Laura how long, and she shook her head, saying we needed privacy. I raised my voice, not yelling, but firm, telling her to answer the question. She looked down at the broken plate and whispered 8 months. I'd been planning our 10-year anniversary trip for 8 months, working extra jobs to save for a bigger house for 8 months, and the whole time she'd been sleeping with someone else. Hannah grabbed my arm, suggesting we go inside, and Ryan started trying to herd guests toward the front, but I told everyone to stay exactly where they were. I said if this was happening, it was happening with witnesses. She begged me not to do this. Said we could work it out. Said it was a mistake. I asked if she loved him, and she didn't answer, which was an answer itself. That's when Megan added that Laura had been talking to a divorce attorney 3 weeks ago asking about asset division. I pulled out my phone and texted my attorney Karen right there. Told her I needed an emergency meeting first thing Monday. Told her I wanted the most aggressive divorce possible. Laura saw me typing and asked what I was doing. I told her she had until end of day to pack and get out. She could figure out where to go, but she wasn't sleeping under my roof tonight. Hannah started to say maybe I should think this through, but I cut her off. A car pulled up front and someone started calling Laura's name. One of her coworkers went to check and came back saying it was Jason. Apparently, Laura had texted him during the confrontation. He came around the side looking confused. And when he saw Laura crying, he started toward her. I stepped between them telling him to get off my property. Ryan grabbed my shoulders saying it wasn't worth it. And Jason backed up saying he didn't want trouble. I watched him get back in his car and drive away while Laura sobbed. I went inside, grabbed my laptop and work files, threw some clothes in a bag, and walked past everyone without another word. I got in my truck and drove to a hotel near the highway, checked in and sat on the edge of the bed. My phone started blowing up with texts from Laura, from Hannah, from people at the party, but I turned it off and stared at the wall. 9 years gone in one drunken confession at a barbecue I'd spent all morning preparing for. This first part shows us something critical about betrayal. It's rarely the cheating itself that does the most damage. It's realizing everyone around you knew and said nothing. Notice how he didn't lose control or get violent. He immediately took action by contacting his attorney and removing himself from the situation. That decision to stay calm and strategic would end up saving him everything he'd worked for. I spent that night going through every memory of the past 8 months trying to figure out how I'd missed it. The business trip Laura took in March that she said was mandatory. The girls' nights that became more frequent. The way she started keeping her phone face down on the table. All these little things I'd brushed off now looked like exactly what they were, a pattern of lying and sneaking around. Around 6 o'clock in the morning, I turned my phone back on, and it immediately started buzzing. Laura had sent 43 texts ranging from apologies to anger to begging me to come home. Hannah had sent a dozen asking if I was okay. Ryan sent one that just said he had my back. I ignored all of them and called Karen's office the second they opened Monday morning. Karen had handled the legal paperwork when I started my landscaping company, and I trusted her because she was sharp and didn't waste time. I met her at her office at 8:30 and laid out everything that happened. She listened without interrupting, taking notes, and when I finished, she asked if I had any proof beyond Megan's confession. I told her I had 20 witnesses who heard Laura not deny it. And Megan had mentioned Laura already consulting a divorce attorney, which meant she'd been planning this. Karen said that was good, but we needed more. We needed documentation, messages, anything that would prove Laura had been strategically positioning herself to leave with half of everything I'd built. I told Karen about the house, how I'd bought it as a fixer-upper before we got married, and spent 3 years renovating it, mostly with my own labor, how the landscaping business was something I'd started from nothing. Laura had contributed financially once she started making decent money, but the foundation of everything came from my work. Karen asked about joint accounts and shared assets, and I realized Laura had access to everything, our savings, the business account, even the credit cards tied to my company expenses. Karen said we needed to protect my assets today, not tomorrow. We spent the next 2 hours going through financial documents and Karen making calls to freeze joint accounts and set up new ones in just my name. She contacted my bank, got them to flag any large withdrawals or transfers from our shared savings, and helped me move my business funds into a completely separate account Laura couldn't touch. She also drafted a formal separation agreement and said we needed to serve Laura with divorce papers as soon as possible. Karen asked if I wanted to try mediation or go straight to litigation. And I told her I wanted the most aggressive approach because Laura had already shown she was willing to plan behind my back. She started outlining our strategy. We'd file for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. We'd fight for me to keep the house based on my pre-marriage ownership and renovation investment. And we'd argue that the business was mine since I'd founded it before we married. The problem was Laura's name was on the house title because I'd added her after we got married, thinking it was the right thing to do. Karen said that complicated things, but wasn't impossible, especially if we could prove I'd put significantly more into the property than Laura had. I pulled up records showing I'd paid the down payment from my savings. I'd done most of the renovation work myself, which saved tens of thousands in contractor costs. And Laura's only real contribution had been helping with mortgage payments the last 4 years. Karen said we'd need receipts for materials, permits I'd pulled, anything showing my personal investment. I told her I kept all that stuff because I'm obsessive about documentation for my business. And she actually smiled and said that was going to save me. By the time I left Karen's office, it was almost noon and I had a plan. I drove to my sister Hannah's place because I needed to talk to someone who wasn't a lawyer. She opened the door looking worried and immediately hugged me. We sat in her kitchen and she made coffee while I explained everything Karen had said. Hannah listened and then asked if I was sure I didn't want to at least hear Laura out, maybe go to counseling. I told her Laura had been planning this for months, had only gotten caught because her drunk friend had a big mouth. There was nothing to hear out. Hannah said she understood, but she was worried about me making permanent decisions while angry. I told her I wasn't angry anymore. I was done. There's a difference between being pissed off and being completely finished with someone. My phone rang, and it was Ryan asking if I wanted to meet up. I met him at this dive bar near his warehouse, middle of the afternoon on a weekday, and he'd already ordered me a beer by the time I sat down. He asked how I was holding up, and I gave him the short version about Karen and filing for divorce. Ryan nodded and then said something I wasn't expecting. He told me Olivia had known about the affair. His wife had known for about a month because one of Laura's coworkers had mentioned it at some work event and Olivia had been trying to figure out how to tell me without blowing up my life. Ryan apologized for his wife keeping it from me, and I told him it wasn't his fault. At least now I knew the truth. Ryan asked if I needed anything, and I said what I really needed was to know who else had been aware of this. Ryan said he'd ask around quietly. And then he told me something interesting. He said Jason had a reputation at Laura's firm for this kind of thing. That he'd been through a messy separation from his own wife, Emily, about 6 months ago over similar issues. And apparently they were still in the middle of their divorce proceedings. So Laura had picked a guy who was already destroying his own marriage to help destroy mine. Ryan said Emily might be worth talking to since she'd been through Jason's patterns before. I went back to the hotel that night and found an email from Karen saying the divorce papers were ready and we could serve Laura on Wednesday. She'd also managed to get me an emergency hearing to establish temporary orders protecting my business assets and preventing either of us from selling or mortgaging the house without court approval. My phone buzzed with another text from Laura saying we needed to talk about the house and money, and I didn't respond. From now on, everything went through lawyers. Here's the key lesson in this part. When you're dealing with betrayal on this level, emotion is your enemy and documentation is your best friend. His obsessive record-keeping for his business became the shield that protected everything he'd built. Also, notice how quickly he moved to secure his assets. Within 48 hours, he'd already frozen accounts and filed paperwork. That kind of decisive action is what separates people who get destroyed in divorce from people who protect what's theirs. Laura got served with divorce papers at her office on Wednesday. And according to Karen's process server, she'd made a scene crying in front of her coworkers before locking herself in a conference room. Karen called me that afternoon saying Laura's attorney, Monica, had already reached out trying to negotiate, which meant Laura was panicking. The temporary orders had gone through and the judge had frozen all major assets pending the divorce proceedings. Laura had moved in with another coworker, according to Hannah, not Megan, interestingly enough. And I told my sister I didn't want updates about Laura's life. The next 2 weeks were documentation and meetings with Karen. We built our case focusing on my pre-marriage ownership of the house, my personal investment in renovations, and the fact that my landscaping business existed independently of the marriage. Karen had me pull together every receipt from the house projects, every permit, every invoice for materials I'd purchased over 3 years of renovations. I found boxes of paperwork showing I'd spent close to $80,000 in materials alone, not counting the hundreds of hours I'd put in doing the work myself. Karen said if we valued my labor at even a modest contractor rate, we could argue I'd invested well over $200,000 into a property I'd bought before marrying Laura. Karen also subpoenaed Laura's phone records and work emails through Discovery. And that's when things got interesting. The phone records showed months of calls and texts between Laura and Jason. But more importantly, they showed calls to 3 different divorce attorneys starting back in February. Laura had been planning to leave me for at least 4 months before Megan's confession, which meant the promotion celebration, the barbecue, all of it had been performance while she positioned herself to exit the marriage on her terms. Karen found emails between Laura and one of those attorneys discussing asset valuation and strategies for claiming half the business. And there was even a spreadsheet Laura had made listing everything we owned with estimated values. She'd been calculating what she could take down to the furniture in my truck. This wasn't a woman who'd made a mistake. This was someone who'd been methodically planning to gut me financially while pretending everything was fine. Then Karen did something I hadn't expected. She reached out to Emily, Jason's wife, through her attorney. Turns out Emily was more than willing to talk because she was dealing with her own divorce from Jason and had her own evidence of his pattern of affairs. Emily provided a statement detailing how Jason had done this before, how he cheated on her with at least 2 other married women from his workplace, and how he specifically targeted women in relationships because he got off on the drama and destruction. Karen used this to paint a picture not just of Laura's calculated planning, but of Jason as a serial homewrecker who'd pursued my wife as part of a pattern. It wasn't about Laura being special or their connection being real. It was about Jason collecting married women like trophies and Laura being naive enough to fall for it. Karen used all of this in our court filings, arguing that Laura had acted in bad faith, had hidden her intentions while gathering financial information, and shouldn't be rewarded for strategic deception. Monica tried to counter, saying Laura had every right to consult attorneys and protect her interests, but the timeline made Laura look calculated and dishonest. We had our first hearing in early August, and I sat in that courtroom watching Laura testify about her contributions to the marriage and how she deserved half of everything. She was wearing this conservative dress, looking like the victim, and Monica asked her questions designed to make it sound like she'd been an equal partner who'd sacrificed her own career growth to support my business. It was complete fiction because Laura had always prioritized her marketing job and I'd built my company on my own time. Then Karen got her turn and it was brutal. She pulled up the phone records showing when Laura had first contacted Jason, February 14th, Valentine's Day, which was almost poetic in how twisted it was. She showed the timeline of Laura consulting divorce attorneys while still sleeping next to me every night, still letting me plan our anniversary trip, still accepting the renovations I was doing on our house. Karen asked Laura directly if she'd made the asset spreadsheet and Laura had to admit she had. When Karen asked why she needed that if she wasn't planning to divorce me, Laura stammered something about wanting to understand our financial position, but it sounded weak and the judge's expression made it clear he wasn't buying it. Karen finished by asking if Laura had ever told me she was unhappy or suggested counseling before starting her affair, and Laura admitted she hadn't. The judge didn't make a final ruling that day, but he granted me continued sole access to the business accounts and indicated he was concerned about Laura's credibility given the documented timeline of her planning. We had another hearing scheduled for late September to finalize asset division. But Karen felt confident we'd won the important battle. Laura's attorney tried one more negotiation attempt, offering to accept 30% of assets if we settled immediately, and I told Karen absolutely not. We were going all the way. The final hearing happened on a Friday in late September and lasted almost 4 hours. The judge had reviewed everything. All the documentation about the house, my business records, Laura's planning timeline, witness statements from the barbecue, including a written account from Megan, who apparently felt guilty enough to help our side, and Emily's testimony about Jason's pattern. When the judge read his decision, he was clear about his reasoning. The house was awarded to me based on my pre-marriage purchase and substantial personal investment in renovations. My business remained solely mine since it existed before and independent of the marriage. And Laura was entitled to a small settlement representing her contribution to mortgage payments over 4 years. It came out to about $40,000, nowhere near the half of everything she'd been planning to take. The judge specifically mentioned her documented preparation to file for divorce while concealing her intentions as a factor in his decision, saying the court didn't reward strategic deception. Laura started crying and Monica tried to argue, but the judge said his decision was final. I walked out of that courthouse and Karen told me the house would be legally mine once the paperwork processed. I thought about that for maybe 10 seconds before deciding I was selling it. I didn't want to live in a place that reminded me of Laura every single day. I listed it 2 weeks later and it sold fast because the neighborhood was desirable and I'd done quality work on the renovations. I made a solid profit even after paying Laura her settlement, and I used part of it to expand my landscaping business and buy a smaller place across town that was just mine. Hannah introduced me to her friend Sophie in November, and we started seeing each other casually. I wasn't ready for anything serious since Sophie understood that, but it was nice having someone to talk to who didn't know anything about my disaster marriage. My business grew because word got around about my work ethic and the quality renovations I could do. I heard through Hannah that Laura and Jason had moved in together. And honestly, I didn't care. They deserved each other. Megan sent me an apology text around Christmas saying she knew she'd blown up my life, but she thought I deserved to know the truth. And I actually thanked her because she was right. Living in ignorance while Laura planned to destroy me would have been worse than the public humiliation of finding out at a barbecue. At least this way I gotten ahead of it and protected what mattered. I still don't trust easily, and I probably won't for a long time. But I learned that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you is also the thing that saves you from wasting more years on the wrong person. So, what can we learn from this situation? First, documentation beats emotion every time. His obsessive record-keeping for the business saved everything he'd built. Second, the moment you discover betrayal like this, call an attorney before anyone else. Not your spouse, not family. An attorney who can protect your assets while you're processing the shock. Third, never add someone to your property title out of sentiment. That decision almost cost him the house he'd renovated with his own hands. Fourth, some people will methodically plan your destruction while pretending everything is fine. Laura consulted 3 divorce attorneys and made detailed spreadsheets while still sleeping next to him every night. That level of deception exists, and you need to recognize it early. The real lesson here is recognizing when someone sees you as a financial placeholder, not a partner. Laura's spreadsheet titled Divorce Assets showed exactly how she viewed the marriage as a business arrangement to liquidate for maximum profit. She thought she could control the timeline and walk away with half of everything. But she didn't account for a drunk friend, a husband who moved faster than expected, and a judge who saw through the performance. Now, I want to hear from you. Would you have handled the barbecue confrontation the same way, keeping everyone there as witnesses, or would you have taken it private? And if you were in Ryan's position, knowing about the affair, but unsure how to tell your friend, would you have spoken up immediately or gathered evidence first? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because there's no perfect answer to these impossible situations, only different versions of difficult choices.